there was global warming.
Right.
And then there was global cooling, and then there was global warming and global cooling. You just go back to the 11 advances and retreats of the glaciers over the past 2.5 million years. Who warmed up the Earth like a million and a half years ago? Who took care of putting the skids on the Younger Dryas climate period? And who controlled the let's say the Little Ice Age or the medieval warm period? You know, when the Vikings landed in Greenland, they found that to be a relatively hospitable place. I mean, sure, there was ice in Greenland, but they found the margins of Greenland hospitable enough for them to settle. Now, they stayed there for, a century or so, and then all of a sudden they disappeared. Why did they disappear? Well, we went from the medieval warm period 1,000 years ago, where exploration by Vikings was great, to a period in which there wasn't such wonderful weather everywhere, when we went into the so-called Little Ice Age. I mean, George Washington had to cross the Delaware at the end and height of the Little Ice Age. These were cold times at Valley Forge. Does that mean it's not going to happen again? No, because we could very easily switch back. We might, in fact, there was an article in Scientific American some decades ago in which a fellow argued that, and I don't know his name and I don't know the title of the article, it's a long time ago, but he argued that we were postponing another ice advance because there are these interglacial periods, and geologists have long thought that we are currently in an interglacial period, that we can look back 2.5 million years and see ice advance, ice retreat, et cetera, over this 2.5 million years, and we've been in ice retreat. So that doesn't mean that ice retreat is over, and it doesn't mean that there won't be another ice advance. But maybe if it's possible that we aren't warming the atmosphere, we postpone that next ice advance, which means you don't have to have Canada plowed into North America by ice sheets 2 miles thick covering 1 million square miles. People just don't realize the circumstances under which humans have evolved. And if we have 250,000 years of human evolution, or maybe even 300,000, as we don't know for sure, of our own species, we have to ask ourselves, what did these people go through to get to where we are today? They had to survive a great many differences in climate. It certainly wasn't. Look, I think there's an argument that a Stradivarius violin has the sound that it has because the wood at that time, the trees that were growing at that time, were under the effect of the Little Ice Age. That beer supplanted wine because vineyards had succumbed to the Little Ice Age. So, thankfully we got beer.
I'm into that. I wouldn't be homebrewing. I wouldn't even have my only hobby if we didn't have the Little Ice Age. I'm thankful.
Well, I think our affinity for beer goes way back to microorganisms, because there is that molecule called cytochrome C, which is in all organisms. And I think if you take human cytochrome C and change it by something like 15, you get a horse. And if you change it by 53 molecules, you get beer yeast. So you can see our affinity for beer.
We are related to beer yeast. Yes. Next blog post. I can't help but think that some of these giant global problems, I'll put that in air quotes because we're only as aware as we choose to be and, study. And so you throw climate in there, and then some of the human afflictions like racism and bigotry and whatnot, they're outside of self. They're bigger than self. We can't explain them. They've always been with us. There's always been war and tribal conflict, and there's always been climate change, right? So, I just can't get off this idea that these are now substituting for religion, right? When we need to explain things, we reach for the thing that makes the most sense to our brains and give us the most sense of certainty, because we don't like uncertainty. We're not good at embracing mystery here in the West, especially. So we reach for these explanations, and then we try to take action upon them because it gives us a sense of control and controlling our future. And it's like, you're only going to be on this planet for 7 or so decades, the Earth will do what the Earth does. Like, I don't know. It's hard for me.
There are controls beyond human controls, and it's possible. Yes, obviously, human beings have in fact changed the planet. If you just fly across the country,
no doubt,
you see vast areas where there were forests at one time, and there are no forests today because it's farmland. And it's, if you look at the Ogallala Aquifer, we've taken water out of that for a very long time. So the recharge rate might be 50,000 years. Well, we're not going to be around 50,000 years from now to wait for that recharge. So yes, we do definitely affect the planet. There's no denying of that. And at the same time, every time we try to fix what we broke, we end up causing another problem. And I think of, I teach coastal geomorphology, and one of the problems is that you think, well, if we put sand here to preserve this particular beach, we are going to save this beach. What we don't realize is there's a longshore transport in the waves and currents along the United States, both sides, where there's something like 250,000 cubic yards of sands migrate down the eastern seaboard every year. And out there in the Northwest, something like 1 million cubic yards of sands migrate every year. Well, if you try to stop those, and you say, I'm going to stop this migration, I'm going to build a jetty or a set of groins into the water, I'm going to stop this. That means somebody down current is going to miss the replenishment of sand. Every time we try to fix something, we are breaking something else. So we did it in Lake Erie, for example. They were worried about the erosion of Presque Isle, which is a recreational area. A spit that goes out there. It was created by the currents moving the sands in Lake Erie, forming this long spit. It's just like Sandy Hook in New Jersey. When you try to save any section of it, you end up by blocking the movement of the sands and saying, we're going to preserve the section. You rob down current areas from getting those sands. So we do that almost everywhere. We think, oh, we're going to fix this, and we end up finding ourselves having created another problem. Why
do we do that? Is it just this Occam's razor God complex? Like we want to.
Yeah, it is, and I think it comes from a lot of well-meaning people. I think these people have good intentions. The people I've dealt with in the government who work with the environment, they're a lot of them are really dedicated people, and they're out to do their best to so-called save the environment. But I keep saying, okay, that's fine, and I'm glad you're after it, but you have to watch you don't go overboard and cause another problem because of it. Because you think of the oil industry started in Pennsylvania, at Titusville in Pennsylvania. So-called Colonel Drake, he wasn't a colonel, but they gave him that appellation so that local people would get respect for him. So he shows up with the backing of a New York financier, and he's going to drill. And he gets and this is before there were the kinds of drilling apparatus that we have today. So he goes out there and he gets local drillers who would have been drilling for water. And the reason he's drilling in Western Pennsylvania is because, for example, one of the state universities is named Slippery Rock, and the stream, Slippery Rock Creek, is slippery because oil seeps up and gets on the rocks and makes it slippery.
I had no idea.
So at Titusville and Oil City in that area, Drake in 1859 started to dig that well. Well, fortunately for, I suppose, everybody after that, and especially for the whales who were being killed off to get the ambergris, for example, and other things that, whale blubber, were supplying for oil lamps. Fortunately for them, he hit a seam with oil in it. And it was very lucky because what happened was when he was drilling, of course, he had no way, he didn't have seismic information. There was no such thing as seismic information at the time. But if you think this wedge right here, the seam was getting thicker and thicker this way. He was drilling right over this spot. So had he been just a few yards over this way, Drake would have missed that oil altogether. And we might have been, who knows how many decades away from finding oil and getting that oil industry going again. But anyway, once Drake discovered oil, everybody went crazy. Let's go get this product now because it had great use. Because now you could, put that in oil lamps. You could put it to lubricate. Pennsylvania has great oil for lubrication. It's known for that oil. And, of course, it's a fuel. So once that started, people went out there, and if you can see old-time pictures, and you go to a museum in Titusville, for example, there are pictures of what it looked like back in the time when around, you're talking about 1859, so Matthew Brady would have been taking pictures of the Civil War, so people were taking pictures at that time. You see essentially a sea of oil stacks, of oil rigs everywhere. And there's no vegetation, and then the ground, even though it's a black and white photo, looks black because it was. And then what they would do for oil to transport the oil, they would put it in big barrels, why we still call barrels of oil, put in big barrels, put them on wooden barges, essentially big canoes, essentially, and float them down Oil Creek. Well, Oil Creek is only about this deep. It's only a few inches deep a lot of the time. So what they would do is they build dams in all the tributary creeks, back up the water, and then when they wanted to take the oil downstream to the Allegheny River and then on down to Pittsburgh and the Ohio River, etc., what they would do is they would break the dams, the water would flood, and those little barges could go down to the Allegheny River that way. Of course, that ended in a disaster one time when all the barges jammed up and caught on fire, and there was this blaze there.
Oh my gosh!
Now, so if you can still see some old pipes lying in Oil Creek, by the way, but if you go to Oil City, which is essentially in the center of that Titusville area where the oil industry runs, and there's still a well, which is the oldest continuous well in the world, running the McClintock well, I think. When you go there, it's a treed area. There are forests, happy little bunnies running around, and deer running through the forest. And there's no sign of all that black oil that was on petroleum, it was on the ground, in a decimated area that had no trees. You might see a rusting old bit of portable oil derrick from the turn of the 19th century going to the 20th century. And that's standing out there surrounded by trees, as I said, ferns and flowers and, hunters looking for deer. Earth has the ability to cure itself sometimes. And it takes a long time, unfortunately, but it does forget about what we do. Its memory isn't always that long. Now, it's like the atmosphere. When the so-called asteroid hit Chicxulub and wiped out the dinosaurs, right? The atmosphere has very short memory. The oceans have a longer memory, so any heat transported into the oceans would have lasted longer because water has a high specific heat. It holds heat longer than the atmosphere. The atmosphere would have lost its heat, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other effects, atmospheric effects. It's just that the way the world works, there are bacteria that consume petroleum. So it's on the ground, it's being consumed. It has a tendency to decay on its own. You don't find that kind of destruction to that environment, Oil City, Titusville area, that occurred during the latter decades of the 19th century. It's gone.
That was only 160 years ago.
That's right. And just, go there today and you'd say, wow, these are nice woods. You go excuse me, a wildcatter who's an individual who goes out and tries to drill a well and find oil, right? Wildcatter. That's named after Wildcat Hollow because there were bobcats in the area, and Wildcat Hollow is one place where that early oil drilling took place. Just a little anecdote.
I know it's got wildcats again. I wonder if some of this urgency is because I keep going back to why do people come into my office? Why do people get mentally ill, for short periods of time or long periods of time? And I think it's an inability to know oneself, tolerate emotions,